Hello, everybody. I am Teresa Vega, and I am excited to be back. I feel like I'm among friends and family. I've spoken several times in the past at the Plainfield Library, and I am happy to be here. I want to thank, of course, the Plainfield Library as well as the Drake House Museum for inviting me to speak. So today I'm going to use my extended family as a microhistory to discuss the Afro-Dutch presence in New York and New Jersey, aka New Amsterdam. And hopefully I can elucidate what it was like for enslaved people and free Black people to live under the Dutch at this particular time. So let's continue. Let me go down here. I'm trying to. I want to first introduce my cousin, Andrea. It's always better if you have someone to help you do your research. And Andrea is my genealogy buddy. We do everything together. We've been researching together for over a year. We are third cousins and we share the same second great grandparents. And the particular line we're going to be discussing is our second great grandmother's line, and she had Malagasy roots. But before I begin, I want to discuss our family history and where all the counties in New York and New Jersey where our ancestors were. My family descends from Native Americans, aka Lenape, and this particular line, both East and West Africans, as well as Europeans. And for Europeans, I'm talking Dutch, British, Scots-Irish. We have we can trace our roots back to 1620, and again, New Amsterdam. Our families were mixed status. Some were free, some were enslaved for a term, and some were, like my fourth great grandmother, enslaved for life. She was only emancipated in 1865, one of the last enslaved people in New Jersey, the last 18. And some of our ancestors went on to become ardent abolitionists, and we have 3 underground railroad houses. One is in Peekskill, New York. One is in Rochester, New York, and one is in Newark, New Jersey. In New Jersey, our ancestors lived all over, but were primarily concentrated in Bergen and Essex, Morris, Monmouth, and Middlesex counties throughout the 18th and 19th century. This is my third great grandmother, Laura Louise Thompson. Her maternal line is M23. And when Andrea and I, over a decade ago, when we first tested with 23andMe, I already knew what my mtDNA is because my maternal line is Irish. My second great grandmother was the first generation Irish American who arrived in Boston in 1875, well, was born in Boston in 1875. However, Andrea tested and it came back M23. And we were like shocked because we had never heard about Madagascar, anything about Madagascar, which then led me to write several blog posts, DNA part 1, 2, and 3, where I descend from 2 different lines from Madagascar, one from Virginia and one from New York, New Jersey. Her paternal grandmother, my fourth great grandmother, was actually Dutch. And she married a man who was mulatto, whose paternal line was Scots-Irish, hence Thompson. But her maternal line is my fourth great grandmother too. And all of her ancestors moved from New Amsterdam to the Tappan Pattern. Her mother was fathered by, Laura Louise's mother was fathered by an enslaver by the last name Pickett, and that Pickett is connected to the Sanford family of New York and Newark. When we discuss slavery in New Amsterdam or under the Dutch, and of course, it starts in New Amsterdam, New York, and then moves and spreads over to New Jersey and also down into Delaware as well. Our ancestors were so-called Spanish Negroes who arrived in New Amsterdam in around 1626. They were captured aboard either a Spanish or Portuguese ship and brought to New Amsterdam, whereupon people assumed that they were actually enslaved when they were probably most likely free blacks, but ended up being enslaved in New Amsterdam. Your first people of African descent were responsible for building New Amsterdam's infrastructure, clearing the land, cultivating crops, protecting the fort from Native Americans, etc., etc. And of course, as I said, the Africans, the early African population came from Angola, West Africa, Madagascar, and the West Indies. And they were bought by enslavers up and down both sides of the Hudson River, as well as in New Jersey. In the initial shipments of enslaved people who arrived in New Amsterdam, the initial shipments were very small. We're talking maybe 10 people, sometimes 20, but they were small until the New York to Madagascar slave trade starts up, where you have well-known merchants like Frederick Phillips, Rip Van Dam, the Van Cortlands, the Schuyler's, etc., where they're actually cutting out the middleman, and they are sponsoring ships going to not only the Caribbean with goods from New York and elsewhere, but they're also going after, like after the 1690 earthquake in Jamaica, they end up going to Madagascar. They try to skirt the British East India Company, and they go to not only Madagascar, but also to Mozambique, and they bring back enslaved people in their cargoes. That journey alone took anywhere from 3 to 6 months. On the way coming back from Madagascar, they would have to stop on the island of St. Helena in the South Pacific. St. Helena is perhaps most famously known as the as where Napoleon was put into exile. And one of the things they had that happened was that there had to be a tax in enslaved people paid when they arrived in St. Helena. And I'll talk about that later when you see some of our matches. And one is a family that originates in St. Helena. But you had, I believe, between 1664 and 1701, you had in excess of 1,000 people, primarily from Madagascar, arrive in ports. And it was New Amsterdam, it was Perth Amboy. We don't really know the exact number of enslaved people from Madagascar who arrived, because these early shipments were brought in by pirates, and they were skirting official detection. So you hear about enslaved people from Madagascar being dropped off on Long Island, being dropped off on the way up to New York from in South Carolina, in Virginia, and Boston. Some of those enslaved people are then further transported to Canada. But we don't officially, unlike the enslaved people who ended up later in Virginia between 1715 and 1721, we don't have an exact number of those who arrived here in the tri-state area. So when we talk about slavery under the Dutch, there are some highlights to remember. Is slavery wasn't codified into law. you had a condition called half freedom that was granted to some enslaved people who had worked for the West India Company for 20 years, who proved their loyalty, who were members of the Dutch Reformed Church, law-abiding citizens who earned half freedom. What is half freedom? Well, it's conditional. In order for you to maintain your free status, it extended to husband and wives. It did not extend to children. In order to maintain that status, you had to do what other Dutch people did, and that is basically be able to and willing to provide security for the fort. You had to pay a percentage. I believe it equals 22 bushels of a crop of grain, whether it's rye or wheat. And as long as you met those conditions, you would maintain your freedom. There are cases in which some of these people who are granted half freedom then are granted full freedom. But the majority of your enslaved people were not granted this half freedom, only very few. Most Dutch enslavers only owned between 1 to 5 enslaved people, with the exception of, wealthy merchants who owned a lot more. And there's a book, which we will discuss in a minute. It's a brand new book, and I hope everybody goes out and buy it, because it's called Spaces of Enslavement by Andrea Mosterman. It's literally hot off the press. It's the most up-to-date research done on the lives of enslaved people and in New Amsterdam. She discusses the ways in which enslaved people negotiated their lives under the Dutch system of slavery and the so-called spaces where they were able to create some freedom for themselves. So I don't know if people have heard about the African burial ground in Lower Manhattan. If you've ever had the opportunity to visit the museum, I suggest you do. It's a wonderful exam, but you learn about some of these spaces of enslavement that offered freedom. And one of these had to do with burial rituals. And some of the archaeological finds that attest to the fact that people were still following some of their African religious systems. And she deems that not only a space of freedom, but also a space of resistance. She goes in some of the things she describes, for example, are in some of these homes and mansions, the places where enslaved people worked and where they slept. And I'm thinking of my cousin Dee Dee, whose ancestors were enslaved by the Lott family in Brooklyn. She even has a picture of the garret spaces. So you had the second floor were bedrooms, and you see these spaces off to the side of the stairs where enslaved people would sleep. In some of the Schuyler mansions and the Abraham Tenbrook mansions in Albany area, you actually see, in the wake of both the 1712 and the 1741 slave revolts, that the spaces where enslaved people slept and cooked were completely separated from where the family slept. And she goes on, discusses what attendance at church meant. And for my ancestors in the Dutch Reformed Church, they were either relegated to the back of the church or the galleys above it. And some of my ancestors then went on to leave the Dutch Reformed Church and actually found their own churches because of that issue as they started. This is the book. I suggest you definitely purchase it. It's a great discussion of a lot of things. This is a picture that was actually being sold on eBay that my friend Rick Gefkin sent me. And as you can see here, here's little Will. And it says, Little Darky Will Slave. This photo's from, look at, about 1865. So he's one of the last 18 enslaved people. This picture sort of is a visual testament of what it would have been like to be an enslaved person if you are the only one. There's a great book that came out a couple of years ago by Holly Metz. That's The Untold Life of Peter Lee. And likewise, you see photos in the book of Peter, whose family was enslaved for generations, and whom he actually served for like generations of the Stevens family, where he's the only one. It was a very lonely experience, as you can see, but I like this photo because not only is this person may or may not be related to us, but he's definitely enslaved by the same families who enslaved my ancestors. But it's a testament of how lonely that experience would be. And when we get to talking about my fourth great grandmother, we can discuss that more. So when you have the takeover of the British, and when the British took over New Amsterdam, it wasn't like bam. It was a slow move towards changing and codifying the slavery. So the British took their institution of slavery that was so successful in the West Indies and basically transported it to New Amsterdam. What you see when they come in, especially after certain events like the killing of the Hallett family in 1708 in Queens, where Mrs. Hallett, who was pregnant, was killed, as were her children and her husband, by two enslaved people. One was an indigenous male and his African descended wife. And so you have this fear of revolts, and then you have the slave revolt of 1712 and later the slave revolt of 1741. So between 1664 and 1730 or so, you have the emergence of Black slave codes. And these codes codified behavior between enslavers, enslaved, free Blacks, and indentured servants. So what do I mean by slave codes? So some examples would be no person of color, being Native American, mulatto, African, could ever strike a white person or they would be punished. Black people could not gather in groups of 3. They had to be a 9 p.m. curfew, and so on and so on. Could not vote. Some of them, early ones, could not like attend church. I mean, there's all these laws that come into effect that amount to heavy surveillance of Black lives, and they stay in effect. And then as you see the British system of slavery come into being, it's then taken up by Dutch families and etc. One of the things, I don't know if people have seen, this is the marker down that marks the slave market down by Wall Street. And one of the things it says is on Wall Street between Pearl and Water Streets, a market that auctioned enslaved people of African descent ancestry was established by a common council law on November 30th, 1711. This slave market was in use until 1762. Slave owners wanted to hire out their enslaved workers, which included people of Native American ancestry, as day laborers, also had to do so at that location. In 1726, the structure was renamed the meat market because corn, grain, and meal, crucial ingredients to the colonial diet, were also traded exclusively there. Slavery was introduced to Manhattan in 1626. By the mid-18th century, approximately 1 in 5 people living in New York City was enslaved, and almost half of Manhattan households included at least one slave. Although New York State established slavery in 1827, complete abolition came only in 1841, when the state of New York abolished the right of non-residents to have slaves in the state for up to 9 months. However, the use of slave labor elsewhere for the production of raw materials such as sugar and cotton was essential to the economy of New York City, both before and after the Civil War. And it goes on to say that enslaved people also cleared and made way for the Broadway, and that we know and love, as well as Trinity Church. What's interesting to hear is to remember at this time that New York City was second to Charleston as a slave port, and New Jersey was third. And that's important to mention, because a lot of people will say, oh, slavery in the North was more benign than slavery in the South. It wasn't a big deal, when in fact, had a tremendous amount of enslaved people. And a couple of, I believe it was in the early 2000s or so, the New York Historical Society had a wonderful exhibition, and I believe they have a book that came out of that exhibit. So back to my folks, in 1678, they left Manhattan and moved to the Tappan Pattern. I didn't note it here, but they also covered the French Pattern, which was a little bit below the Tappan Pattern. Our Afro-Dutch families include the de Vries family. John de Vries, Captain John de Vries, arrived in New Amsterdam with his Creole wife from Brazil. And at that time, the Dutch controlled Brazil, parts of Guyana, Suriname. He arrives, and his son is considered, John de Vries II is considered one of the first mulatto children born in New Amsterdam. You have Klaus Manuel, a descendant of Emmanuel de Angola. Emmanuel gets truncated to what we know today as man. You have Van Dunk, Adrian Van Dunk, and you also have Anthony Van Saley, who was known as like the Turk. This line also today includes descendants with the surnames Moore, Milligan, de Groot. Back the early Dutch, Afro-Dutch, they married Dutch women. There was more sanctions against adultery than interracial marriage. These early members, as I said before, were members of the Dutch Reformed Church. So you can actually go back and read Dutch Reformed Church marriage and baptism records and find Afro-Dutch listed. One of, and I'll get down to this book here, there's a well-known book that was written in the mid-80s called The Ramapo Mountain People by David Scott Cohen. He deems our ancestors to be Jackson Whites. That is a slur, so don't really use that. But one of the biggest criticisms I hear from my Ramapo Lenape cousins is that it acted as though these people were 100% African, and then they were almost as if they were moved to the Tappan Pattern and became, fake Native Americans, when in fact, a lot of them had intermarried in New Amsterdam prior to even going to the Tappan Pattern. And as the British started, instituting their Black codes, what you have is people who were going back and forth across borders. Why? Because they had family in New Amsterdam. They had family in parts of Orange County and family in New Jersey. And as these Black codes come into effect, we see some of our ancestors moving further up into the Ramapo Mountains. And then you have some who stayed down the mountain and decided that they were going to actively resist, and they became abolitionists. So we have both sides. Now, regarding our Blauvelts-Schmidt, aka Smith-Haring, enslaved ancestors, when out of, again, the 16 Tappan Pattern land grantees, 2, the Mans and the de Vries, who later were followed by the Van Dunks, end up in the Tappan Pattern, but there were 14 other land grantees, all Blauvelts-Schmidt's Herrings. And when I wrote my blog post years ago, I thought they were three separate families, only to come to find out that it was actually one extended family. What's interesting is, to this day, when I look at my ancestry.com matches, I forget the number of Blauvelts-Schmidt Haring, especially Haring DNA cousins I have in the 5th to 8th cousins, who are all going back to the original inhabitants of the Tappan Pattern. So when they moved over, they of course were enslaved from the 1600s till 1865 until my 4th great grandmother was emancipated by this family. This line is among our most endogamous line. They married not only to each other, but they married into our Afro-Dutch line several times over as well. And Dutch families, of course, as many, if there are any Dutch descendants here, they're endogamous anyways. I mean, it's incredible when you look at that. And wherever the Blauvelts-Schmidts, Haring descendants went, so went our ancestors. When Andrea and I first started doing research over a decade ago, we were like, how come they're everywhere? How come they're everywhere? But then when you ultimately find out just how long your ancestors were enslaved by this one family, it makes sense, right? When we talk about the Van Wickle slave trade and our ancestors were owned by Abraham Buckaloo, Timbrook ancestors, we can go back and look at the Cornelius Timbrook, who migrated from, I believe, Ulster County prior to the Revolutionary War to Middlesex County. So it's our ancestors followed wherever their enslavers went. And in addition, some of our ancestors went on to found Skunk Hollow, and before they actually branched out to other counties in New Jersey. So this brings us to the Revolutionary War. Our ancestors fought on both sides of the Revolutionary War, hence they were Black loyalists who ended up in Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, the Caribbean, London, Sierra Leone. The Book of Negroes is a great genealogical tool, both for formerly enslaved and also because it lists the loyalists, the white loyalists, and people might not know that their ancestors actually had fled with either enslaved people or had enslaved people fleeing them. Graham Russell Hodges just came out with a new edition. I read that book over a decade ago, and when I opened up the book, and this is the book, I highly recommend this book. One of the things, I went through the book checking off enslaved people in Connecticut, New York, New Jersey. I found direct ancestors of ours from Greenwich, Connecticut listed, with the man that we had already knew was heavily involved in the transatlantic slave trade out of New York and out of Connecticut. But if you look over here, you see a Smith-Haring. In parentheses is the loyalists who vouch for their service. Formerly slave to Daniel Haring, where Tappan Pattern tells you where they fled. You have Thomas Ogden. We had ancestors who worked for the Ogdens. And it tells you the former slave of Stephen Baldwin. He was basically neighbors to our ancestors, and it talks about New Jersey. You have down here Thomas Smith. He was enslaved by Sparrows, maybe. Again, maybe is one of our surnames. You come up here, Bogart, and one of our surnames, Tappan Pattern. You come down here. Thomas Brown. Brown is one of our surnames, and you see the location. And again, you have William Dunk. I'm pretty sure it's Van Dunk, enslaved to John Blauvelt. So this is a great genealogical tool for people who are looking for their ancestors. Now I'm going to talk about some of our ancestors. We were lucky enough to find my fifth great grandfather, who was a Black Patriot. He was born in Orangetown, New York, Rockland County, circa 1750. Again, when you're researching enslaved ancestors, back that far, there aren't a lot of, the paper trail is very skimpy. However, what we do find out from military records is that he was enslaved by Reverend Benjamin Moore, who right after the Revolutionary War was the Reverend of Trinity Church downtown. And his wife was Charity Clark Moore. The Clarks are right up in Orangetown, as are the Moores. And Samuel was originally owned by James Freeman. So that Freeman is an actual surname. It's not a surname that he took once he became free. We're pretty sure that not only did he was enslaved by Benjamin Moore, but he worked for the 22nd Beat in Lower Manhattan. So I'm living in Northern Manhattan, so I'm actually where my ancestors, Lenape ancestors, have always been, but I'm actually where my Afro-Dutch ancestors have always been. But we believe he fought in Hardenberg's regiment out of Orangetown as well. Once freed, he becomes a master chimney sweep with his own business. So far, we've identified some of his children based on a variety of records, probate records, city directories, etc. There was Samuel Jr., there was John, there's an Amos, Henry, William, my fourth great grandmother Toon. We don't know the name of her sister who worked handling a grocery store on Reed Street. And there are other relatives that we know are related, but we don't know if they're grandchildren or nieces or nephews. There's Sampson and John Freeman, who end up in Newark. There's Artillo Freeman, who ends up as a Black Patriot in Massachusetts, but was from New York. And you have Charles Freeman, who we know is related to us by a fifth cousin. However, she doesn't know who his father is. So we don't know if that's a grandson or a nephew. This is the 1790 census. And I wanted to point out, here's Samuel here. This column here is free Blacks, and these are enslaved people. But this is Samuel Van Brick. Anna Marie Mabie married Samuel. So you just see in 1790, my fourth great grandmother isn't born yet, but look at where probably her parents and a sibling are, just a couple houses down. This is the 1800 census in Orangetown. As you can see, Samuel is here. And if you look, I mean, you see some of the names that are Smith, you see Clark. Margaret Graham is someone who Samuel Jr. was indentured to. And we do have a corresponding Dutch Reformed Church record that says they were Dutch Reformed Church. I believe that there's one in 1821 that says both Samuel and his wife and Samuel Jr. were Dutch Reformed Church members. And then we come to my fourth great grandmother. So imagine, go back to the picture of Little Will. Imagine what it must have been like for a young girl enslaved. Toon was born circa 1795 in Orangetown, and she was owned by Frederica Blauvelt and his wife, Anna Marie DeWint. And when I talk about patriots, our Black patriots were right up there in the shadows, whether it was New York City or New Jersey, Newark. In New York State, the DeWint House is most known for the two times that President George Washington stayed there during the Revolutionary War. She was willed to their granddaughter, Anna Marie Mabie, when she was 5 years old. She was either sold or loaned out many times over. I think we have to date 4 or 5 merchant families, all interrelated by marriage. She ends up fathering three of her children were fathered by an enslaver um, who was part of the Canfield Sanford family. She had my third great grandmother when she was roughly 14. She had her brother a year or two later. And then in 1814, I know you can't read this, but she runs away with a baby who she named John Green, who was a sailor off of the Tappan Patent, working in New York City. And she has a baby, and she names the baby John Green after her husband. So there's some agency there where she's actually claiming a surname beyond Freeman, which is Green, which is also interesting because we have Greens who are in Westchester as well. And it mentions here that she's formerly owned by Mrs. Ann Mabie, and so we know it's the same. And it says she's either working in New York City, probably as a domestic, or she's hanging around her father's, a Negro family by the name of Freeman that lives in the lower part of a house or at the corner of Reed and Washington Streets. At this point, if anyone's familiar with Tribeca, Reed Street at this time went beyond where it went over to the docks where the Highline Park is. And that basically the house that her father has his business is occupied by Henry Webb, and he owns a grocery store, and that a black girl, Sister Tatoon, attends the store for Mr. Webb. We don't know who that person is yet. And basically, they want her back and they issue a reward. We don't know what happens, but we know that there is a record of births in Morris County. And at one point it says that there's a woman and child who are in the city that's probably Toon and this child. She eventually ends up back in Morris County where she was working. And in 1819, she has another son named Charles Pickett. So that's 3 children by an enslaver. We don't know how she makes her way back to the Ramapo, but she ends up marrying Pompey Snyder, and they go on to have 5 children. At the time, we knew Toon had a son named Samuel. We didn't know the significance of Samuel, but she goes on and has a second Samuel named Samuel Snyder. So now we know Samuel was named after a Black Patriot dad. She ends up working for Jarrett Ackerman, where she was a slave servant for 40 years. You can go back to the 1860 census and see her listed as slave servant. We do know that when Jarrett Ackerman died in the 1860s, he provided for her and told his descendants she was given a piece of land. Not only was she given a piece of land, but Samuel Snyder was as well. And she passed away in Washington, Saddle River, Washington Township in 1881. And her children and grandchildren continue to live on that property. In the 1860 census of Charles Pickett, we see a woman who's 80 years old, born circa 1780, by the name of Jane Rickett. We also see an 80-year-old woman by the name of Mary Wheeler. We now believe that both of those individuals, because the White Thompsons were in-laws to the Ricketts, we have every reason to believe that maybe both those individuals, as well as the Whalers, both those individuals are connected to our Thompson line. They might, in fact, be sisters to Thomas Thompson, or relatives of Thomas Thompson. This nice individual is the grandson of our Samuel. There are two long newspaper articles. Very fascinating individual that tells the story of what a sailor would have been like. So he was born circa the 1780s. He was born on Murray Street. He was one of 14 individuals. His parents died when he was in his early teens, but he recounts seeing George Washington speak in what he calls Potter's Field, which is now Washington Square Park, when he was 7 or 8 years old. He remembers that Murray Street was right where Collect Pond was. There wasn't any development there. He tells this wonderful story that him and his brother caught a turtle. So imagine turtles in New York City at that time. And it was so big, they were able to sell it to the hotel for £5 of money, which was a lot of money in those days. He goes on to say how when he was a kid, he used to remove stones from the streets in Brooklyn Heights. At 9 years old, he was working at a tobacco store factory on Chambers Street. When he was almost 14, around 14, his father indentured him to a Colonel Hunt out on Long Island, Sag Harbor, and he worked there for him until he was 21, whereupon he became a sailor, working on whaling vessels as both a steward and as a cook. How he took up the job as a steward and cook on numerous ships and traveled throughout the Caribbean, and also to Africa and also to the East Indies. And in 1856, he enters the Snug Harbor Sailors' Home on Staten Island, where he passed away in 1897. I showed this picture to my sister and to my cousins, and we were remarking how that nose looks just like my grandfather's nose. But he tells the story of remembering that there was a whipping post in Washington Square Park, and he can't remember the other one, but he remembers the names of the whipping post. And he also remembered watching the execution of a Black man who was caught setting fires to New York City. And he was made to watch that execution. So imagine what a life like that represents. And the reporter also noted how he spoke so many different languages. And of course, you had to speak multiple languages if you were going to negotiate. Think of the space. And you're dealing with the Caribbean, you're dealing with Africa, you're dealing with the East Indies. You had to, if you worked as a sailor, you had to be multilingual. These are some of the surnames that are directly traceable to our line, both in New York and New Jersey. And as you can see, a lot of Dutch names are there. And I'm going to point out our Van Riper names. We have one ancestor who fixed the horseshoes of George Washington's shoes, like in Morris County. He was Afro-Indigenous, by the way. Of course, you see some of these names that go back to both Dutch and Scots-Irish folks. What I find interesting when I get to our recent discoveries is our lion ancestors who we trace back to Greenwich, Connecticut. Newark was founded by Connecticut Puritans, and we're seeing the linkages between our Connecticut Puritans who end up in Newark, as well as our Thompson's ancestors, one of whom ends up being buried on Lyons Farm in Newark. So those are some of the names that are connected to us, which gets us to the infamous Van Wickle slave trade. So I don't know if people are familiar with the story, so I'm just going to do a short recap. So in 1818, mind you, slavery is outlawed and you have gradual emancipation in New York and in New Jersey. Well, New Jersey, I should say. There was one ship that left Perth Amboy, wasn't caught. There was another one that was caught early in the spring of 1880. That particular ship was seized. It so happened that someone had placed a runaway slave ad for their runaway slave, so they thought, and someone pulled it aside and said, oh, I see him in New Brunswick and Judge Van Wickle's house. And Judge Van Wickle had basically had a I want to say almost like a guarded fort where he was illegally shipping people south to be sold into slavery forever. So you had primarily young people being told that they were going to be working contracts when in fact it was enslaved for life. So this slave owner went looking, and once he found it was Judge Van Wickle, he sounded the alarm. That sloop, it was a small sloop, maybe could hold, I believe, 20 to 40 people, was seized. At the same time, you got to remember West Jersey heading into Pennsylvania was heavily Quaker and abolitionist. At the same time, there was a coffle being that Judge Van Wickle created that had been caught walking enslaved people into Pennsylvania. So there was a court case. A third ship went out. And then in I believe it was early October 1818, as the trial was going on in Philadelphia, and Judge Van Wickle basically turned state witness. There was the last slave ship that snuck out October 25th. And I was talking to Calvin Sherman, who on your reading list, there's a book he wrote. He has a whole chapter on the Van Wickle slave trade, the business of capitalism and slavery. I was tweeting with him and I said, well, I had done the initial research on a Malagasy Roots project. And when we found out that Isaac B. Timbrook, who later became an abolitionist, was working as a farmhand in 1850 on Stephen Van Wickle's, the judge's son's farm, I was like, wait a minute, we have these matches from one person from Alabama. Is it possible that we had ancestors who were sold south? He sent me the slave ship manifest. On that manifest, you saw these surnames. And I remember I just cried because there was no doubt that some of these people were ours. No doubt. When you look at the Malagasy Roots project, and for people who don't know about it, I run that, coordinate that, and administer that project with C.C. Moore, one of the country's most well-known genetic genealogists. But the whole point of the project was to connect people today with their DNA cousins of Malagasy descent. So far today, and my family alone, we've tested over 30 people. One of our favorite matches, may she rest in peace, was my cousin Helen, whom I met when she was 98 years old. Her grandmother was Laura Louise's sister. And she found me via her nephew on Ancestry. It just so happened that I live in Northern Manhattan, and she was getting a stent put in at Columbia Presbyterian Hospital. The first time I met her, she looked at me and she said, now I can die in peace. I met my mother's people. And I just want to cry every time and I begged her not to die because I was like, I just found you. And she went on to allow me to test her mitochondrial DNA. I'm kicking myself in the butt because I wish I had thought to test her autosomal, but the mitochondrial DNA was perfect. There were two things she remembered that she said to me. And this is where I tell people my research is ancestor guided, because she said not only can she die in peace, but that she held on to two memories. Her mother died, she was born 1921. Her mother died when she was 5 years old. Prior to her dad remembering, he used to drive her to the Ramapo and say, this is where your mother's people are from. And he used to take her to her mother's cousin's shoe store. That shoe store was owned by my great-grandfather before the Great Depression. So I told her she couldn't die. We had to get her to 100. And on her 100th birthday, I rolled up early in the morning, helped her get dressed. And she told me to sit by her the entire birthday party. And everyone who even came to give her a greeting, birthday's greeting, she would introduce me as her cousin from her mother's side, because it meant so much to her. In her honor, I actually wrote a blog post about her Blanchard line. And that line we actually trace to a French Huguenot who owned, whose wife owned, I believe it was the Tontine Coffee House, Lower Manhattan, and whose ancestor bought his wife and some of his children out of slavery. And they formed one of the earliest first Black families of the Oranges. So, you know, you never know what that DNA will. And her, she's a gift that keeps on giving, because she has so many matches that not only go back to these places, but also directly to Holland. These are some of the descendants of the Timbrook family. This is my cousin Francis, whose ancestor was enslaved by Abraham Buckaloo. And then these two at the bottom, Dorothy is a direct descendant as to Rose Fortune. And on her family has a disruptor in that I believe her second great grandmother was a ward of the state out in Long Island, but whoever signed her death certificate wrote Timbrook. So we know we're connected to the Fortunes. This is our Alan in his family. And Alan's grandmother was half Malagasy from the island of St. Eustatius. That's his mother and his daughter. And these are some of his grandmother. This is our Francis and our Fortune line. This is our cousin Brenda and her mother and grandmother, direct descendants of Rose Fortune. And what's interesting is over the years, wherever we find our Thompsons, we find the Francis and the Fortunes. They were originally enslaved by the Devoe family, a French Huguenot family, Devereux, that originated, I believe, on Staten Island, that ended up in New Jersey. And it's so funny because wherever we find the Thompsons, and as the Greens, whether it's Westchester, New York City, all over New Jersey, there goes the Francis family. And if you look at the book of Negroes, and you can just see how many Francis formerly enslaved people were in New Jersey, who ended up not only in Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, but also in London, also in Sierra Leone. And these are our connection to the Van Wickle slave trade. I left out two additional people whom we found in the past year, who one of whom just tested on 23andMe, Lenora Goldberg, who's the last two their ancestors ended up in New Orleans. So you see the direct connection that to the Van Wickle slave trade. And again, slavery was built on capitalism. Here's a list of the products that were sold. And if you follow this line, You see from New York, you're having rum, iron, gunpowder, cloth, tools being sold. Coming back, you're having enslaved people from the West Indies going in up here. You're having fish. So capitalism is very much, um, that's the wind that made slavery sail all over the place, literally. Some of the issues that we need to talk about if you're doing any sort of genealogy research is what's in a name. If you're doing research, you have to understand that over time, Dutch surnames become truncated. So if you're looking for Kovenhoven and you don't know that that name becomes Conover, that could be your brick wall. So you really have to research how names change, and they change in a number of ways. You have the names become anglicized. So Jansen becomes Johnson. You have enslaved people who, if you're doing enslaved ancestry research, who didn't have surnames, or they took the names of their enslavers. But that's not always the case, because we know that enslaved people took completely different names before and after the war. When I originally started looking at the early Dutch Reformed Church records in Newark, you could actually see how some of our Thompsons stayed Thompsons right after the Revolutionary War, and some of them became Goosebecks or Grosbecks. Some of them were whalers because they happened to be owned by Caleb Whaler, but they were actually Thompsons. So, part of that had to do with their children being indentured out. But if you don't know that and you assume that the names that some enslaved people have are always static, you're going to miss out. I give an example. My cousin Joan has a Black Patriot ancestor who was known as John Rowland as a patriot. But after he became free, he took the surname, because he was free, of Freeman. Now, think about her and think about our Freemans, which is an actual surname. So when you're researching, like, think of the nightmare I just stepped into, that now I have to vet if our Freeman people are actually surname Freeman, or did they just adopt the surname Freeman when they became free. It's a nightmare, but it's one that you have to pay attention to. One of the books I'm so mad that I left off the reading list is a book called Black Loyalists in New Brunswick. And in the Book of Negroes, there is a man who bought his freedom from Caleb Whaler. And in the Book of Negroes, he's going by Caleb Whaler. But when you read his story in the Black Loyalists in New Brunswick, again, you can't assume that people with the same last name were actually genetically related. So although we have Thompsons who are whalers, clearly they're not related to this guy. Why? Because he tells of being brought over from Ghana. He's a Khan. And when he becomes a Black loyalist and relocates to New Brunswick, he becomes a leader of his people, and he basically, in an act of resistance or reclamation, he takes on his African surname, which is Karankaboom. So again, the issues of names is one that you have to be wary of. A lot of people have brick walls when doing, for a number of reasons, doing enslaved ancestor research, because they don't want to make the jump. And one of the things that people have to remember is both before, during, and after the Revolutionary War, and up until the War of 1812, those were migratory events. You're not talking a lot of Black people, especially in rural areas like New Jersey, maybe in the city, but once you get into the rural areas, it's a lot less people. So these folks traveled. if you were a free Black, you're only like tiny step above enslaved person. Um, because you were free, you couldn't be a ward of the town. So you had to move in order to make a living. So you hear these stories, like we have one ancestor, his name's Ichabod Purdy. When he died, he was known from Albany to New York City. And you're like, how is that possible? Well, he became a stagecoachman and he traveled. But what the most interesting story is Purdy isn't his actual surname. His surname was Alar. His father, we believe, was a Black Patriot as well, but he was from Phillipsburg, the town, Phillipstown. So that takes you back to Phillipsburg Manor. And his father became emancipated, worked for Charles McEvers, who was a big time merchant out of New York City. So he was able to accumulate wealth, which he passed on to his children. His children, in turn, became relatively wealthy as well. So those are some of the things. Now, my current research, along with Andrea, I should know, has been digging up some wonderful stories in the archives that I can't wait for her to write her own book on just some of the stories that are awesome. But we're focused now, we basically tracked down who Thomas Thompson, the family he descends from. These were all merchant families on our Thompson side and on our Malagasy descended ancestors side. They're among the founders of Newark, and they actively traded on Wall Street. Some of the surnames, and they include both the Dutch, British, and Scots-Irish families. I know you guys heard of Governor Island. Well, Isaac and Nicholas Gouverneur are right there. The Kemble family, the Hill family, Hercules Daniel Buys emancipated my fourth great grandfather, Thomas Thompson, in 1800. He had set him up in 1790 Newark to become the first stagecoachman, transporting the richest folks from Newark, not only all the way into the city up to Albany, but also to Philadelphia. You have Captain Thomas Bibby. You'd have Ephraim Morris. Ephraim Morris line, I should say that line is responsible originally for the Morris Canal and later for the Morris Essex train. And of course, the Thompsons, Northern Manhattan, you have a famous architect who owned a house in Inwood Hill Park, which is right up the street from me. Samuel Thompson was an architect. Not only did he build that house, but he was responsible for building the Custom House. He married in Newark and in Elizabethtown. And you have the Johnston family of Morris County, Sanford of Morris County, Jeremiah Burroughs, interesting character, the one who put the runaway slave ad in the newspaper. He was a merchant that sailed up and down the East Coast and also had ties throughout the Caribbean, Africa, and in Bristol, England. He actually skipped out, interesting character, skipped out on his debts in New York, ended up in Charleston, skipped out again, died in New Orleans, skipped out again. You have the Rickett family. Most notable of that family is John Bill Rickett, who founded the first circus in Philadelphia and also brought the circus here to Lower Manhattan on Greenwich Street. And again, you had Charles McEvers, who was a big time merchant. These families were very endogamous. We all know, which we found out prior to and during the Revolutionary War, these merchants were actively involved in the transatlantic slave trade in the Dutch, meaning Curacao, St. Kitts, and St. Eustatius. St. Eustatius, of course, was the country that first recognized the newly formed United States of America. Danish, St. Croix. We know one of our, we know that some of the enslaved people who worked in the copper mines, the Schuyler copper mines, were from St. Croix. Sorry for that typo. And we know we have an ancestor who became an abolitionist named Peter Vogelsang, who was from St. Croix. And of course, the British Caribbean, AKA Barbados, Jamaica. We are now combing through probate, accounting books, local history books, searching for our ancestors. And of course, this work is never easy. And that is the end. And the artwork is my own, so I'm engaging in some of the stories through my artwork. The end.